Okay, well, welcome everybody. So happy to see everyone here. Happy Wednesday. Thanks as always for taking some time out of your day to meet with us today. So we have a lot to get through today and only 2.5 hours to do it. So we're going to go ahead and dive in. Because we have a lot to get through, we're not going to go through a round of introductions. We will let folks in as they start to trickle in the meeting. But because we won't be doing introductions, if you guys don't mind, we would love to have your full name and company as your Zoom name at the bottom of your little square. Just so we have a good sense, everybody has a good sense of who everybody else is and a reminder of where you guys all work. So the way to do that is to hover over your name, and there'll be 3 little dots on your name. If you click on that and you go down to rename, that should allow you to add your full name and company to your Zoom name. And also to help us record attendance today, we'll be checking and making sure we've got everybody. But if you don't mind dropping your name and company in the chat box, that would be fantastic. And then we can just pull that from the chat. So today we're here to continue our discussion and deliberation as a task force on the building performance standards for the state of Colorado. You guys were chosen for this task force because you represent stakeholder groups from around the state whose input is needed for this for this rulemaking process. And when we're done here with this task force, we'll have created a recommendation for how the building performance standard will regulate the energy efficiency of existing buildings across the state. And eventually that recommendation will be moved into policy to help the state reach its larger greenhouse gas emission goals. So today, you guys are the experts, just like every task force meeting, who will be asking the questions, making the decisions, and leading us to our final recommendation. So thank you again, all of you, for your time and being here today. During our meeting, we're going to build upon what we discussed at our last meeting, and we'll be discussing, voting, and lobbying for different methods of a building owner can pursue to earn compliance with the building performance standard. And so we'll dive into what our agenda is going to look like in just a moment. First, I want to hand it over to Crystal to quickly review our task force schedule.
Hey everyone, thank you again for everyone joining us today. As you know, this is meeting 7, and we have lots of ground to still cover. So in light of the discussion that we still need to have around the building performance standards and the metrics, the state has decided to offer optional meetings. We're treating these as sort of meetings that will contain overflow from some of these task force meetings. Other cities have sometimes called these office hours, but essentially these optional meetings are optional, and they'll last around an hour. And Kim and I will host these as the state. And what will happen is that whichever task force members, if there are certain topics or details from like today's meeting or future meetings that you want to bring up and talk about, maybe something that we didn't get to talk about in lots of detail in today's meetings, you could attend the next optional meeting, which is April 13th. And so it gives us more time to talk about some of the aspects of the building performance standards in more detail. And all of the meeting materials will be shared on monday.com and also shared out. If there are any decisions that are brought up or ideas that are brought up, anything that is talked about or discussed in these meetings will be brought forth for the whole task force at the next task force meeting. And due to the Open Meetings Act, these meetings will be live streamed for the public as well. So yes, so we have a couple optional meetings, as you can see on the schedule here, that we added April 13th, May 11th, and June 8th. And what we tried to do was schedule them in between the task force meetings, so about 2 weeks apart. And you also see on the schedule with the public engagement, since we still have lots of items about the building performance standard to discuss and vote on, we pushed the public engagement to later in May and early June, since one of the main points of the public engagement is to bring forth the recommendations to the public and to the different audiences. So we did push those meetings out, and we are still working on those materials. So we will definitely send any updates to the task force once we have them. I'll pass it back to Kim.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Crystal. And I know we just had a couple people hop in while Crystal was sharing the schedule. So just quickly, welcome to everyone. And if you guys can please rename your Zoom selves with your name and your company, that'd be fantastic. And then also for attendance sake, please drop your name and company in the chat box so we can make sure we caught you if you're here. Okay, so we're going to go through a couple of slides that you guys have seen before. But very important today is our meeting norms. We are going to, like I said, have a lot to get through, and we'll need to really stay on target today. So please remember these as we move through our meeting. Our general Zoom etiquette is cameras on and mute when you're not speaking. And thanks to those who have dropped in the chat that their cameras are off. Really appreciate you letting us know. Remember, there aren't bad ideas. All ideas will be considered, so please feel free to speak freely. Share your thoughts and share this space. Be respectful of each other and be present as much as possible for the conversation. Remember to leverage your expertise and not your position. And then let's be very considerate of all of our viewpoints today. There is a new meeting norm we wanted to add today, and this meeting norm is called ELMO. ELMO stands for Enough, Let's Move On. And I'm guessing you can probably understand what it means based on the acronym. But what we're after with this meeting norm is we're going to need to stay focused, like I said, during our discussion today. So I'm going to be encouraging each of you to avoid diving into rabbit holes in our discussion that don't contribute to the objectives of our meeting. As Crystal mentioned, we're going to have those optional meetings available for the task force where there's a topic you just really feel like we need to flush out. You can bring it to those optional meetings. But today we really want to try to stay focused and keep from diving down into those specific rabbit holes that can get a little distracting. So thanks in advance for adhering to our new meeting norm. Quick overview of our goals and outcomes for the task force process as a whole. You all, as the task force, are here to ensure that the building performance standard recommendations that the group comes up with are equitable and promote a low carbon and clean energy economy. The recommendations that come from this group, we hope will lower energy costs and improve indoor air quality. And then, of course, these recommendations are going to contribute to the greenhouse gas emission reductions goals for the building sector that for this process are 7% by 2026 and 20% by 2030. And again, those are greenhouse gas emission reduction targets for the built environment sector in Colorado. And just a quick reminder of the guiding goals that you all have deliberated on and voted in. I'm not going to review these one by one, but just want to leave these here as a reminder to help guide your thinking and your process today. You also, I just wanted to quickly remind the whole group that the task force had expressed while we were writing these guiding goals that we want to make sure that building owners are provided different options to be able to be compliant with our building performance standard. And so we're going to be discussing and deliberating on what those options could look like today. And then a quick, again, review of our timeline. The building performance standard deadlines are the ones along the bottom of the timeline there, and those are the ones applicable to our group here. So our task force process is going to take us into July, where we'll finalize the recommendations, and then those recommendations will be passed off to a number of folks to finalize the rules, and then they will go into effect in June of 2023. Then there will be 3 years for building owners to reach that first site EUI target by 2026, and then they'll report on how they did in June of 2027. And before we talk about today's agenda, I just wanted to do a quick review of what we covered during the last meeting. So at our last meeting, we discussed a bunch of different options for demonstrating compliance that we could include in our building performance standard. We discussed all of the options. We looked at pros, we looked at cons, and then, as you guys recall, we moved on to a brainstorming session using a Miro board, where we asked you guys to write down your thoughts, ideas, questions, considerations for each of those pathways or compliance options that we were looking at. And then at the end of the meeting, we held a preliminary vote on those compliance options. And that was really super helpful for our internal team to test the waters to see where you guys were leaning one way or the other as it went, as it related to the different options for compliance. And so all of those things we processed, we learned from the input that you guys gave us, and you'll see a lot of that reflected in our meeting today. And before we go on to the agenda again, I wanted to give you guys a summary of what we heard from you all on these different compliance options. There were really great notes and insights, and so I know that these are very short bullets compared to the awesome notes you guys included in the Miro board. But quick summary, we heard that performance compliance, in other words, ensuring that a building's is reducing their energy consumption by way of reducing their site EUI, is absolutely the core compliance option for building owners. And I didn't include it on slide because there was 100% agreement with you amongst you all that is what we are here to do. For a prescriptive option, while we had some folks that were supportive of it, some that were not, generally what we heard is that it should not necessarily be its own compliance option and might be better suited as guidelines or as a hardship pathway for a building that's having issues complying with the site target. For accrediting renewable energy, again, there was general support to allow this with a couple of considerations. The first is that we're only counting the incremental benefits above what the renewable energy that the grid is already delivering, and that owners of that renewable energy must retire the renewable energy credits. For beneficial electrification, general support again to include as a compliance option, and we saw several notes indicating that we should encourage partial electrification rather than needing to go all the way for full electrification. And then we had this other category on the Miro board. And what we saw in the other category is that some option for demand response or reducing peak demand should be considered, especially as we're moving towards our 100% clean energy grid. So again, we took all of these notes and thoughts today, and we're excited to present a couple of proposals to you guys that will help take all of the input you gave us and frame them with some edges and corners on what it could look like within the building performance standard, and then we'll give an opportunity for you guys to react and discuss and add your thoughts to it. Excuse me. So we've made a couple of really important decisions so far as a group, and those are finalizing those guiding goals and using site EUI as our primary metric. But we have a couple of really big decisions still to make. And today is going to be a really important day for decision making. So you'll see in the box in the red, those decisions that we need to make, and our agenda will take us through how we're going to look at those. So to kick off our call today, we're going to hear from Group 14 about the development of their modeling tool and an estimate of the energy reduction that buildings will need to make in order to meet our sector-wide greenhouse gas goals. And after Laura presents, you guys will have an opportunity to ask questions and discuss the implications and really try and wrap your heads around sort of our early phase modeling. And I know Laura will emphasize this, but I will say it again, it is very early phase modeling. So just please keep that in mind. Next, we're going to move into the decision-making phase of our meeting. And for each phase of decision-making, we're going to follow the same pattern. So first, we'll share with you guys the straw proposals that were put together by the CEO, but were taken from all of the great input you guys gave us at the last meeting. Then we'll give you guys time to discuss, to react, to deliberate, to ask questions, and then finally we'll host a vote. And there'll be a mechanism with which we use to vote today, and I'll explain that a little later in the meeting. So we're going to follow that process of proposals, discussion, and voting for the BPS proposals for site EUI. We'll take a break after that. Then we'll dive into the renewable energy and beneficial electrification in the building performance standard. And I wanted to note, because I've said this a million times, I'll say it once more, we have so much to get through today. We're going to try to limit the discussion at each one of these decision-making points to about 15 minutes. So please keep that in mind. If you have thoughts to share, try to keep them concise today, because we really want to make sure we're saving time and space for everybody to share their ideas. So So our objectives today are to decide and vote on how the BPS will use site EUI to reach our greenhouse gas goals. And then we will discuss and vote on how renewable energy and beneficial electrification will be able to be used as a method for compliance. So lots to look forward to. So I will pass it off to Laura with group 14. And Laura, I believe you have your own slide. So I'm gonna stop sharing and pass it over to you.
That's great, thanks. So no slides per se. What we're gonna go through today is, as Kim mentioned, the preliminary version of the policy modeling tool that we've put together. Let me just pull up my notes on the other side, make sure we have everything addressed. So I want to take you guys through what we've been doing. So first, I want to give you some high-level background information. First of all, the model is based on emissions factors provided to us by CDPHE for 2021, 2026, and 2030. Those are going to make up the baseline, or those are going to make up the emissions factors that we're using for all of these calculations. The other data that's going into this is currently 2019 data. That was the most complete year of information that we had between the benchmarking data coming out of Denver, Boulder, Fort Collins, and then we also got summary data from the EPA for any other buildings that we're benchmarking in the state of Colorado. The plan is to update this information with the 2021 benchmarking data once that is available. But just so you know, this is right now 2019 data as we are doing these preliminary numbers. A couple of other things to note, we had approximately 8,700 buildings that we are looking at for this model. Of those 8,700, we had about 700 that are missing area information. Based on the EPA data, we know about 45% of the buildings fall in that 50 to 100,000 square foot building category. And then it starts dropping off as you get larger buildings. So for those 700 buildings, we are using an estimated 75,000 square feet. The energy data that we're using as our estimate right now, obviously the benchmarking data coming from Denver, Boulder, and Fort Collins is the best real world data that we have. We are using the summary information coming from the EPA. We don't have individual building information from the EPA, but we do have a great summary that they provided. And that summary is being used to provide a median EUI by building type. So we did categorize each one of the 8,700 buildings as a particular building type. And based on that building type, it was assigned a median EUI for that category. Buildings that didn't have had no information on building type were given the statewide median EUI. So that's just a quick background on the information that's being plugged into this. This first page is the inputs and outputs page. Right now, it is fairly limited to that EUI reduction target. So some of the things that you guys will be talking today is how we achieve that target, whether that's through an assigned EUI target by building type or an overall percent reduction. And right now, this is modeling both of those scenarios, just because, depending on how you work it, how you decide to move forward, we can get more granular in how we model those, but this is a pretty good way to model that percent reduction, regardless of which path is chosen today. What we have built in here is the starting date. So right now I'm assuming 2023 is the starting date, but this will impact, you can select other dates if we decide we're not going to start making people meet those reductions until a little bit later, or we assume they don't start working on those until a little bit later. This does have an impact on the slope of the line for the percent reduction. The other thing that we have included here is this Denver electrification policy. This is going to change the split between the electricity and natural gas savings that we need to achieve. If we're assuming Denver makes up about 25% of the total energy use for these covered buildings, if they are electrifying in their new construction and existing buildings, as we expect them to do, it does shift those greenhouse gas emissions a little bit, because we have fewer natural gas greenhouse gas emissions to reduce while increasing the electric greenhouse gas emissions. So that does have an impact on this graph here, and will have an impact on these reduction goals. On the output side, we have a couple things. So I just want to touch base on what the difference is between the business as usual and the baseline. So the baseline is what our goals are going to be based off of. The baseline emissions is going to be its 2021 energy use data at 2021 emissions rates here, 2026 emissions rates, and 2030 emissions rates. So the assumption is that we are holding that 2021 energy use constant. The difference between that and the business as usual is business as usual. Keep in mind, as our building stock increases, as we have new construction, we're adding more buildings, we're going to see an increase in our electric and natural gas usage. So inherently, our business as usual energy use is actually increasing. So that means we need to save more for the building as business as usual than we do compared to the baseline. So you see we have these two numbers just so we can kind of see what is the difference between the reduction from baseline and the reduction from business as usual. The other items I just want to touch base on are the goals and how I set them in here. So the goals are set, the future emissions of 2026 should be 7% reduced from the 2021 energy use that's been converted to 2026 emissions factors. The same concept was applied to 2030. Just want to put that out there. I feel like you guys have had these discussions, I know before, but just want to make sure it's been clarified here too. So, and then finally, this graph is really just a graphical representation of the information above. I personally can digest a graph much easier than I can a bunch of numbers. And then we also have the energy use savings coming out of this as well. We'll do a quick review of some of the other outputs, but then we'll go through and I'll show you some of the results that we're seeing. The other information that I have outlined, we have this detailed outputs information. The output details is all, again, table information, but it's feeding into these output visuals. Again, I just find the visuals an easier way to digest it. Some of the takeaways that we saw were, we took a look at the public versus private building counts. I apologize, I just realized I don't have percentages on these graphs, so we'll get that updated. But then we also took a look, and the interesting thing on the public versus private, I think a lot of these were not necessarily part of the benchmarking data. So this graph between building count, building area, and building energy use looks extremely similar, which is why I only put the building count up here. On the building count, building area, and energy use breakdown by building size, we can see the majority of our buildings are in that 50 to 100,000 square feet. And while they do make up the largest portion of building area and energy use, our other buildings, so the 500,000 square foot, it gets to be a fairly even split between all the building sizes, just because of course those larger buildings, even though there's fewer of them, are going to use more energy. A few other things, I did a breakdown by building count by county, just to see, compared to the rural counties versus the Front Range, where is the time and energy to implement this policy going to take place? Our largest, as we would expect, the largest number of, the counties with the largest number of buildings are typically on the Front Range. And I only did this for the 19 counties with the largest number of buildings, just because it gets very messy as we start adding in all these other buildings. We do have a couple counties that have literally a single building that fall under the covered buildings list. And then finally, we did this based on building type, just to see what the majority of our buildings fall under. Based on the estimates that I made, the majority of our buildings in the covered buildings list actually fall under multifamily housing, followed by other, I wasn't sure what these were exactly, and then office and K through 12. So it's pretty high level information on the output information that we're seeing. But I guess the big thing that we want to see is, right now we've got 2 targets. We can put in the option to just do 1 target, but the way it's built right now is setting a target to reach the 2026 goals. And having played around with this, we'll just jump right to it. To reach our 2026 goals, we need to save about 13% of energy by 2026 to reach that goal of 7% greenhouse gas emissions reduction. And the 2030 goal, this is a delta. The way the calculation is working, it's essentially a delta between the 2026 reduction and the 2030. So we need to save by 2030 about 30% to reach that 20% greenhouse gas emissions goal. So this is just looking at that difference between 13 and 30% as we get to 2030. As you can see, our energy savings, as you would expect, is that 13 and 33%. The reason those are higher than these 13 and 30%, again, is the reason is because the business as usual, we need to save more than business as usual to meet our goals. All right, I'm seeing some, I don't know, Kim and Crystal, best way to start answering questions. I was noticing some.
There's a few questions. Why don't we start out with Kathy's question? She had a question about adjusting for usage for 2021 due to COVID. Obviously, we don't have the 2021 data yet, so I think we're going to have to wait a little bit and see what that looks like. But just wondering if you have a response to that modeling.
We've done a couple of these models for other municipalities, and what we've noticed is, well, it's a good question, Kathy. In general, we haven't noticed huge differences in the 2019 versus the 2021 data. But there are some. It would have to be a discussion with the state to understand how we handle that.
Let's see, and the next question is from Bill Green, and we can try to answer this too. I thought we had to use a constant grid emission factor between all years so we don't count on grid emission improvements. I believe the way that we are approaching this does make sure that we are accounting for the greening of the grid.
Yep.
And then Michael Gifford has a question about calculating the amount of energy use or emissions that from state buildings or public buildings, since they have a different threshold that they have to reach in order to actually comply with the building performance standards. So I think you did reference that we have, what was it, 8 or 9% are public buildings? I can't recall the exact percentage.
Yep. So it's a little less than, let's see. And I apologize for not putting those percent, 8%, yeah, are public buildings. We did not individually calculate greenhouse gas emissions by building and building sector. That is something that we can add.
Let's see, any other questions? Oh, Nori has a question. Oh, okay.
I think, Nori, your question, so it's the majority of the buildings are private buildings, not public.
Got it now, thanks.
Yep, sorry about that.
And Kara, to your question, yeah, maybe you can talk a little bit about how you modeled that for Denver, and then we can go into that further when we actually talk about our beneficial electrification recommendations.
Yep. So we were, Group 14 was the ones that put together the policy tool for Denver. So when we added in this electrification, it's coming directly out of Denver's policy tool that we built for them. Right now, it's just the static numbers, assuming that they continue to follow. So those code cycles, 2024 and 2027 for new construction code cycles, and then 2025 and 2028, I believe, for the existing buildings is how they're implementing it. So we took, you can see in our baseline emissions, this is where we have our calculations. Right now, we're just pulling the numbers from our Denver results straight out of that tool and putting them in here. And you can see I just turned that on. So it's, if we say no, we're at about 7.7% and 22%. And if we do account for that electrification in Denver, we have increased savings because of the electrification. Any other questions? Yeah,
I
didn't
think
have much else to add.
Awesome. Well, thanks for everyone for those great questions. And thank you, Laura, for that fantastic presentation. So Laura, I don't know if you would like to stop sharing and then we can pop back over to the PowerPoint.
And then Bill, it looks like Bill had one more question.
Oh yeah, please. Sorry about that.
So did you assume heat pumps were used for all building electrification? Yes, when we worked with Denver, the assumption was that heat pumps were the technology they were using to electrify systems. We did assume a 80% efficiency for natural gas systems moving to 250%, just to be conservative.
Awesome. Thanks, Laura.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead
and just sorry, I wanted to get back to Nori's question too. We need to wait to get in a lot of that data from the benchmark buildings to figure out exactly where they fall within private ownership, public ownership, and things like that. So it's a little bit of a moving target, this covered buildings list. Again, all of it was based on tax assessor data. So there's got to be a lot of cleanup once buildings start to report. And they actually already are starting to report because a lot of them are in Denver, Boulder, and Fort Collins, which have deadlines of June 1st. So we have started getting some buildings already into compliance with the state. It's a very small fraction at this point, less than 1%. But we'll be doing this until December 1st, which is the statewide deadline. Thanks. Kim, go ahead. Sorry.
No, great. Thanks, Kim. And Joel, you have a question, follow-up question?
The question, yeah. Have the letters gone out to building owners notifying them of the December 1st deadline?
Yes,
Okay.
they have.
Crystal did that. Yeah.
Yes, the letters went out in March.
And we are doing a press release any day now about our new Building Performance Colorado website. We have a fully staffed help center, technical support and resources to help building owners comply.
I will share our website's link in the chat, but again, this is our benchmarking website. Feel free to share it among your contacts. It has lots of our resources and compliance information on the website.
And just one more comment from Bill saying, realize that not all buildings can be converted to heat pumps. We did take that into account, Bill, when we were working with Denver. So our model for Denver only is converting rooftop units and furnaces to heat pumps. Denver does have in their ordinance that systems that are cost prohibitive will not be required, or existing buildings at least, will not be required to electrify until it can reach cost parity. So hydronic and boiler systems are not being converted to heat pumps in that model. It does assume that all new construction will have electrified heating and space heating and water heating systems.
Thanks, Laura. And then comment from Nori would be great to include in the website and the slides for public outreach, please. So Nori, yes, we'll make sure that that gets in there. Thanks. Okay, I want to last check for final questions for Laura before we move on. Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Laura. So we are now, and I'll share my screen again. So now we're going to start moving through the decision-making process and portion of our meeting today. And as a task force, you guys have had to make some really important decisions to date. So today this will just be a continuation of what you guys have been doing already. And before we begin, I just want to recognize that decision-making in this context, when there are so many inputs and things to be thinking about in different scenarios, it can be really overwhelming to think about making a singular decision when there's so much to consider. And the role that you guys are filling on this task force is incredibly important because you're creating a recommendation that's going to inform a rule that will impact a lot of different Coloradans. And owning that responsibility and even looking at this image sometimes, I like it because it is slightly overwhelming, and that's how decisions like this can feel. But you all were chosen for this group because of your expertise and experience. And we know that that will lend itself to some well-rounded and robust recommendations. But with all of that in mind, and knowing that there's no pressure on you all to start making these decisions, I just wanted to start by level setting with everybody and remind everyone of a few key points as we move into our decision making. And the first of which is a concept called group wisdom. And the task force, all of you were brought together intentionally to provide that wide array of experience and expertise. And the effort to develop these recommendations focuses not just on the individuals in this group and the individual expertise that you all bring, but the integrity and the wisdom of the entire group. And that means that we all don't have to have every answer in this group. We all don't have to be experts in every area. And we can rely on the other experts and folks in this group who have that experience to guide decisions in areas where we might not feel comfortable in putting our stake in the ground. And so I really want to emphasize that trust and looking toward fellow task force members to help bridge the gap between, oh, I need to know everything, and I can make a decision knowing that the integrity and wisdom of the group is guiding that decision. And so I will ask you guys to really trust your fellow task force members to identify where we might be missing opportunities if it's something that you yourself might not catch, right? And then the second key concept is just that this effort overall is part of a process. It's one leg of a much larger race that we're running. And I like the analogy of a relay race because I like the idea of, this task force developing this recommendation and then passing the baton on to the next team member who is going to carry this across the finish line. So the first leg of our race is your guys' expertise, your experience, these task force meetings where we're able to discuss and deliberate. And at the end of these meetings in the middle of the summer, we'll have that recommendation that we can pass off to our fellow team members. Those team members in this race that we're calling are the energy office, the governor, the air division, the AQCC, and all of these partners will be there to help move the building performance standard across the finish line. And so all to say that there are going to be many checkpoints through this process. And there'll be a lot of opportunities for these different members of our team, our larger racing team, to provide input, to provide checks, to make sure that if there's something that gets missed or something that needs to be altered, that we're catching those. And we'll also have an opportunity through this process, through this race, to get public feedback and input. So we as a task force can trust this process and know that if our recommendation doesn't take into account every little detail or something changes and we didn't catch it, that those things will be found and addressed because there is still a race to run after this recommendation is finalized. So with that, hopefully that takes a little bit of the weight and the pressure off your guys' shoulders. Do a little shoulder movement to feel loose and ready for our discussion and our decisions today. And we're going to start with proposals for site EUI. So Kim Burke, I will pass it to you to take us through the straw proposals for this.
Great, thanks, Kim. And just before we go in that down that road, I just wanted to remind everyone that yes, we have decided as a group, as Kim already mentioned, to use site UI as the primary metric. But again, we have to decide kind of how we're using it. And as a reminder, site energy is the amount of heat and electricity consumed by a building as reflected in a building's utility bills. So actions taken within a building directly affect the building's site EUI. And of course, one of the primary goals of a building performance standard is efficiency, or lowering that energy use and demand on site. You can go to the next slide. So with that, we wanted to put forth a couple of different proposals. There's two, and so we're going to separate them out and then we'll put them side by side so you can see. Essentially, this first proposal is very similar to Denver's BPS and how they're doing it. It is a building type specific EUI target. So essentially, there will be a bunch of different building types, based on how EPA Energy Star Portfolio Manager categorizes buildings. The task force won't do this, but Group 14 and the state as a whole will calculate whether normalized a target EUI for each building type for 2026 and 2030. This can include normalization for factors such as occupancy and operating shifts. And just to note that those target EUIs will use state-specific data when available, and we will have more of that data, obviously, once we have one full year of benchmarking data from 2021. We also, again, have a fairly good ideas from Denver, Boulder, and Fort Collins, but obviously want to take into account the rest of the state when we set those target EUIs. If there are not enough buildings in a particular type, then we may have to rely on some national data or, for example, data from CBEX or something like that. So essentially in this proposal, each building will have to meet the target EUI that's applicable to its building type. And that reduction or target EUI, again, will be based on modeling. Let's see. You can go, so again, the task force role, we don't have to set those individual target numbers. It's really around making the recommendation as the approach that we want to take. You can go to the next slide. The next proposal is just kind of easier. We could just set a sector-wide % reduction in site EUI. So we'd have every building type, or basically all buildings would have the same % reduction in EUI. So individual, if we say it's 20%, then every building would have to meet that 20% reduction. And it would apply across, equally across all property types. Obviously, there's some pros and cons to that, and we can talk about some various considerations. But again, it's really just a simple, like, we can just say that we need to meet this 20% reduction, and that's what all buildings would have to do. So obviously, this approach might not work as well for buildings that have already done a lot of improvements prior to setting this standard. It might not work as well for high performing buildings that can't reduce anymore. So there's definitely some considerations to take into account there. So we get that, but so we can talk about that a little bit more during the discussion. If you can go to the next slide, we just put them side by side here. So essentially these are two different proposals. There is the possibility that the task force could recommend both. For example, and we probably want to have a primary one, but for example, if a building is just really far away from its target EUI, they have no chance of getting it, could they still be in compliance if they say reduce 20%? Just a thought that could be included in some kind of alternate compliance pathway there. And again, in both cases, for both proposals, there can be considerations for high performing buildings that really can't reduce anymore, or they might already just meet their target EUI and they'd be good to go. So I think with that, we can move on to talking, discussion.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Kim. So there are a couple questions that came in during your presentation, so we can start there. And then I will leave this up so you guys can continue to look at these as we discuss today. But the first question from Kara. So sorry, to clarify my question, if the building is already lower than the required EUI, are they off the hook for the requirements?
Yeah, essentially, if they're already meeting or lower than that site EUI, then yes, they would be off the hook in that building type. That's how I think we would interpret that.
Mm-hmm. Great. And then a question from Kirk. Multifamily complexes often include many individual buildings within a campus. Is the site EUI target at the campus level or at the individual level?
Yeah, that's a good question, Kirk. I think we did allow some, I think the statute does allow certain types of buildings to use the campus site UI, but I'd have to look into that more and see for sure. But we can certainly, again, the task force could make that recommendation that multifamily complexes or, hospitals or universities that want to report as a complex could meet the site UI at a campus level. So, I mean, the task force could make that recommendation. Is that helpful?
Yeah, could I recommend, sorry.
Yeah.
Could I recommend a third choice for sector-wide reduction? Could that be based on property use type? So certain property use types would include a sector-wide reduction while others would be individual specific UI targets.
Sure.
Certainly. So you're thinking, so what I can do is we'll get to that in a moment. I want to make sure I'm capturing that because we're going to do some voting here soon. So I'll maybe right here would be a good place for that. So basically it would be for a subset of building types, they would have a building type specific % reduction. And then for others, it would just be an individual compliance. Am I hearing that right, Kirk?
Yeah, so sector-wide reduction would be determined by property use type.
I see. Okay. Okay. Great. Thank you. A couple more questions coming in through the chat. So Bill Green asked, the legislation specifically requires a % reduction from baseline. Could the building specific EUI be an alternate compliance path?
Yeah, I think so. I think we just want to decide on, a primary compliance path that would work for the majority of buildings here. And then we can provide, then the task force can make recommendations around, exceptions or alternate compliance pathways. But I think we do want to come to a decision on what the majority of buildings will meet for this.
Great. Thanks, Kim. I'll read one more from the chat, and then Christine, I see your hand up, so I'll get to you in just a moment. Joel asked, for EVs served by the building, I would like to propose we provide an energy allowance per EV. This could be based on the vehicle miles traveled per EV. I don't think mandating submetering is a reasonable requirement.
Yeah, I think that's fine. I don't know that we necessarily need to call that out specifically, and I don't think we would mandate submetering, but I think there would be a way to identify which portion of the energy use can be attributed to electric vehicle charging and find a way to exclude that.
I'm also gonna chime in here and just try to see if we can take a step back really quickly. All of the comments coming through the chat are great. I know Kim is going to actually start talking about a lobbying vote process, but so Kim Burke just talked about both these proposals, and I'm wondering, and maybe Christine Berger, maybe this is one of your comments, of what is the general feedback. I see some questions coming in about site UI and how site UI defined for the building types and what's included in that, but then also some recommendations for what to include under these specific proposals. Can we kind of take a step back and get your general feedback for the primary compliance path with the site UI? How's the task force feeling? Are you all leaning more towards the building type or the sector based?
Thanks, Crystal. And Christine, I'll pass that off to you since you've had your hand raised. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. I had a comment in response to Bill's question about the legislation specifying a % reduction. I think even though the legislation specified we need to get to a % reduction, that's the outcome, but that doesn't mean it's the path we need to use to get there. It doesn't specify that we need to use a % as the way we get there. So I think either of these would be fine within the legislation. And then I guess while I have the floor, Crystal, you asked for general feedback about these two. They both seem like good approaches. I'm leaning slightly towards the green one for two reasons. It does seem like it better accommodates high-performing buildings that have been taking efforts over the years to on purpose to reduce their energy use. And then second, because since Denver is already doing it, that's a strong point in its favor, so that we don't have two competing different mechanisms, which might confuse the market, especially for those buildings that are in Denver. And I think about a quarter of them are in Denver, so it's a significant percentage.
Thanks, Christine. And Paul, you had your hand up and then it seemed like it was lowered. Do you want to chime in?
I was just flagging. I had posted a question in the chat, seemed to have gotten missed, but it kind of went to your question, Crystal. It was more a detail about how do we define site EUI. So I was simply asking, sites vary tremendously even with the same kind of building. So we have very large variances in energy outside the building use. And do we want to include that in site EUI? Whether that's site lighting, whether that's outbuildings, the obvious example of EB. But since that's a detail, we can set that aside. And since I'm speaking, I'll just say I also prefer the first one, which is building specific. Besides the reasons that Christine provided for liking that one, my thinking is it would really let us focus in on the inherent challenges that go with different building types. So healthcare versus housing versus office versus education. Each of those is going to have different challenges here in Colorado. And I like that this would let us be more specific and fine tune it. So that's my reasoning. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Paul. And the floor is open. So if we'd love to hear feedback from any and all members of the task force. Feel free to raise your hands. Nori, yeah, go for it.
Hi, thanks. I also prefer the building type. There's kind of seduction to that super easy percent across the board sector based, but for the building types, I didn't realize how much the multifamily was going to lend, and there's so much variety within the multifamily component that I think we could tailor. It would be easier to tailor the building type specific EUI targets to meet various types of buildings within that one sector. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Nori. Bill Green.
Yeah, the only thing about built-in specific EUI targets that concerns me is there are some buildings that are so far away from EUI targets that Denver has proposed that they have no hope of getting there. And so we need a way for them to achieve 20% and still be in compliance. So that's why I think it could be one or the other, maybe, as a compliance path.
Thanks, Bill. And that's a fantastic point. And as Crystal mentioned today, we're really looking at our primary framework for those buildings who might be experiencing hardship or might need additional help in gaining compliance or alternative pathways that they can use to get in compliance. That will be a discussion we will have. It's just not the discussion for today. So please hold that thought. And I believe our topic for next time we'll be diving into how do we support buildings who we know are going to have trouble with achieving our primary target and metric.
And to add on to that really quickly too, like Kim said, we're talking about alternative compliance in the next meeting, but with that first proposal of building type specific targets, one of those alternative compliance paths or ways that buildings that have higher energy use can show compliance with that path is that they get a higher EUI target based on their energy use. So just keep that in mind for the next conversation.
Thanks, Krista. Any other thoughts? I think I saw one more hand up, but it might have gone back down.
I just wanted to, for option 3, just add additional color commentary there. So my thought on that was kind of related to the institutional type of buildings with some kind of oddball usage. And I am in support of the individual building metrics. But my thought is to just consider those sector-wide reductions for kind of either institutional or other kind of properties that have these kind of outlier property use types to, provide a pathway for them to participate because they may want to participate, but their buildings don't fit into the nice kind of neat box that portfolio manager offers. So I am in support of the individual metrics. So.
Great, thank you, Kirk. Okay. Other thoughts, discussion? Yeah, Kara, sorry.
Hey, sorry, perhaps I'm a little slow on the draw today. I don't know if I fully understand option 3. Can you walk me through that again, please?
Would you like me to explain that?
That would be great.
Hey, Kirk.
Yeah, and it aligns with individual. So it's a little bit misleading that it would be in the orange box. It's every individual property would still have a metric, but for institutional property, I guess I'm thinking about Colorado State University educational facilities, DIA, some other kind of owners that might have outlier properties. They could potentially look portfolio wide. It would be a little bit easier for them to hit the target, so it's maybe less a reduced requirement in that regard, but it does allow, rather than just say, okay, well, I can't participate because my buildings don't fit into the nice neat box that we've prescribed. It kind of allows an alternative pathway for those types of folks to at least participate if they want to.
And I'll just chime in quickly here too. I know a couple of other people have raised hands. Could we, Kirk, you said you agree with like the building type proposal, then could we just make a consideration for an alternate compliance pathway for other, again, some of those institutional properties and other buildings that have a hard time? Is that what you're thinking? So does it necessarily need to be option 3, or can we just go with like building type is the main compliance pathway, and then here we have the, as an alternate, I don't know, building, hardship buildings or things like that.
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
I support that. I think that's a great idea and a good compromise.
Great, thanks for that clarification, Kirk. That was really helpful, and for Kim as well. Stacy, I think I see your hand up. Go for it.
Okay, now I'm unmuted. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Kirk. I think, yeah, I appreciate that. On a university campus, again, we're not everybody, but maybe DIA is another great example. On a campus like that, we've got every building type imaginable, right? And so certainly internally, we might set building performance goals ourselves around, hitting certain performance targets based on building type that makes sense. But when I've got EUIs in the 30s and I've got EUIs in the 800s, when I think about coming into compliance in the spirit of the legislation, if I can look at all of my portfolio of buildings and say that I want to reach a 7% or 20% reduction across all my portfolio of buildings, it helps me to make better use of strategic dollars for those strategic investments. Right, so I appreciate that, whether we think of it as an alternate compliance pathway or not. But in general, I'm still supportive of the building type specific EUIs. But I do think for campuses, it'd be really helpful to be able to look at my reduction target on a portfolio basis of all the buildings that are in my mix. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Stacey. Laura, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to give, so Group 14 did help provide the technical support to Denver as they calculated their building EUI targets. So just wanted to give a little information. Denver really did go for closer to a combination of these two for what we were calling standard buildings, and a building specific EUI target was calculated based on if we had a statistically significant number of buildings based on the Denver data that was available in benchmarking. If we didn't have enough buildings in that building category, we did look to national median EUI data. For buildings that are unique, I think, which is the concern for a lot of people here, things like museums or the aquarium or the zoo, which we did not have enough national data, or data in Denver, they did recommend a 30% reduction of the current EUI. So it was a little bit of a split between these two, and just thought I'd give that background information.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. It's helpful. Okay, any other thoughts, reactions, anything that you guys want to share in regards to these two? Okay, great. Well, I'm not hearing any. So that means that we'll move into the portion of our meeting where we're going to be voting. And so I really appreciate the discussion and adding in this alternate compliance option, because that's kind of what our voting is going to allow us to do. So I'll explain the voting mechanism. I will share a quick example so we don't get too sidetracked, and then we'll move into our first vote. So I guess I could share again. That might be nice. You guys don't have to see the present or just the slide deck view. Okay, so this process is this voting mechanism is called a lobby and vote. And basically what it means is that we are going to take you through a process where we'll allow you guys to vote, and then allow you, as you'd like, to lobby that specific elements get added or removed or changed in our original proposal, so that at the end of our process, we have a fully vetted proposal that includes all of the nuances and detail and things, considerations such as the one that Kirk brought up. So I'm going to walk you through how it works. Basically, we will start with a statement that we're going to vote on. And for our proposals, all of the proposals we're going to vote on are going to be yes or no questions. We're not going to be asking this proposal versus that proposal. It will be this proposal, yes, no. Proposal number 2, yes, no. So we'll first share the proposal, and then we'll conduct a preliminary vote. If we get to a 2/3 consensus in that initial vote, we will consider it final, and we will include that proposal in our larger building performance standard recommendation. If the vote receives a majority, so 50%, but does not get to that 2/3 consensus, we're calling that 66, roughly 66%, that will open the door to lobbying. Now, what does lobbying mean? Lobbying means every person who voted no, if you would like to have it, will have the opportunity to lobby the group for 1 minute on why you might not like the proposal, but most importantly, what you would like to add to or change about the proposal. And that, I'm going to emphasize again, that is going to be the most important thing that you share in your 1 minute of lobbying to the group. So for everybody who votes no, we'll ask you guys to identify yourself, and then we'll ask the folks who want to lobby. We'll time you, you'll have 1 minute, so keep it tight, keep it concise, and you'll share the why not and the what you want to change. After each individual lobby, so let's say I've raised my hand, I voted no, I lobby you guys for a minute, and I have a request of what I want to change for the proposal. We will pause at that point and have a vote to see, does the group like what I suggested or not? And we'll look for a 2/3 consensus on that vote to say, yes, we want to include Kim's suggestion, or no, we don't like Kim's suggestion, we don't want to include it in our original proposal. And we'll go through that process for each individual who wants to lobby. Once we've gone through everybody, we will take a final vote on the original proposal plus all of our accepted changes that that we may or may not have accepted, but let's say we've accepted a couple through the lobbying, and we'll need a 2/3 vote again to move forward with that final proposal. So a couple of key things, and I'll bring up an example so to help illustrate this. And once we get the flow of it, I know it will go quickly, but a couple of things to keep in mind. And we already shared this, but the proposals we're voting on today should be viewed as the proposals that are going to impact the majority of buildings in the state. We're not looking to discuss like the specific or special circumstances that might be included in a hardship path. Today, we will have time to discuss that later. So just try and keep that in mind as we're moving through the votes. And then finally, I just wanted to point out our last bullet. We like this phrase, say it in a headline, because with only 1 minute, you just you need to keep your thoughts concise if you would like to lobby the group. Okay, so our example is very silly. So just please know that it's very silly, and we know that. But here's an example of how this process would work. So alien invaders that eat humans have come to Earth, and we're trying to decide what to do. The proposal that I am bringing to the group is that we banish the aliens back to their planet, and that if that takes some force, then that's okay. So we hosted a preliminary vote, and 51% of you guys said, yes, I like the idea of banishing it. 41% said no, so we are going to accept the proposal that we will banish the aliens. So lobbyist number 1 comes in, and they voted no on the original proposal. They think, I would like to propose a change that we invite those aliens that are vegetarian, that won't eat humans, to live on Earth because they don't pose a threat to us. The group votes on that proposal, and 70% of the group says, yes, I like that. We are all in for the vegetarian aliens. So that will then be added to the original proposal. Now, lobbyist 2 comes in and says, I just want to kill all the aliens. I don't think we should banish them. Let's just wipe them all out. And the group isn't so responsive to that. 15% vote yes, 85% vote no. So that second idea for lobbyist number 2 is dead in the water. We're not going to include that in our final proposal. So after we've heard from our 2 lobbyists, our final proposal we'll be voting on as a group is that we banish but don't kill all human-eating aliens from the planet. We allow aliens to stay if they're vegetarian. We vote on that. It is 75% yes, so then that final proposal is the one that's accepted. So we know that's very silly, but does the process itself make sense? What we're going to go through. Okay, great. So I'm going to move to the next slide, and we're going to launch the poll. If, again, we get to 2/3 consensus, we will not have an opportunity to lobby. We will just accept the proposal as is. If we don't reach 2/3 consensus, we'll allow for lobbying. So if you voted no and you would like to lobby, I will ask that you raise your hand, and then we'll go through one by one and lobby with you guys. Okay, great. So, and Kim, I want to ask quickly, do we want to include Kirk's recommended alternative compliance path as we're voting for this proposal?
Yeah, it's a good question. I feel like I want to have, and Kirk actually chatted me because he had to step away, but I think we want to keep this as one proposal for the majority. Let's think about this as affecting the majority of buildings. And then maybe we can add a vote around adding in that alternate compliance pathway.
Okay, fantastic. So okay. Yeah, that sounds great. Okay, so we'll start with this one. This is the first proposal that was in the green box. Does the task force want to recommend that a building performance standard use building property type specific site EUI targets? And I'll go ahead and let everybody answer. And we're looking for 14, or is it 14, Crystal? 13?
We have 16 members on the call. With Kirk stepping away, we only have 15 people voting right now.
Okay,
but he did put his vote for number 1. So
okay, great.
So we can count it as 14.
Sorry, okay, that's 14. I was gonna say I have 16 task force members attending. So it looks like, okay, now we have full vote.
Okay, great. And Crystal, would you like to share the results?
Yes, looks like it's 100%.
Okay, so easy peasy. You guys made this vote very simple. Great. So we will move forward with recommending that the building performance standard use property type specific site EUI targets. And because we got 100% vote on this one, we are not going to vote on the second one. But Kim, would you like to include a vote on Kirk's alternative compliance path that he brought up?
Yeah, then we might have to do that right after the break or something, just so we can put that in an actual poll. I don't know if we can.
I can do that right now. Just give me 1 second.
Okay. No, I wanted to give you time, so no rush.
Okay, well, let me stop sharing. And we'll add a slide for that very quickly. Are there any, while we're doing that, are there any clarifying questions or ideas on Kirk's proposal? Does everybody have a good sense of what he was recommending? Okay, seems like everyone.
Yeah, it sounded like he was specifically thinking of campuses, right? I'd be nervous to expand it too far beyond that without talking through it, but I was okay with campuses. And similar arrangements of buildings.
That I would ask, is that considered also a hospital campus where you have hospitals with hospital buildings that surrounded? Is that the same?
I think so, depending on the ownership. It seems like if it's the majority one owner, then yes, but if there's 30 buildings and 20 owners, maybe not.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I also think what's inside those other buildings that are around the campus would have something to do with it. It's just a standard MOB with folks providing very light services. Then it could be different versus the hospital and folks attached to the hospital and what they're doing. Because there are some instances we don't own the land, there's an MOB on it, but it's not connected to the hospital. So I just get a little nervous. Yeah.
I would think it has something to do with the owner type, the owner arrangement, and the metering arrangement. Who's on the utility bills? Some combination there.
Yeah, that's fair.
That's what I think. I think of it that way too. Or I mean, I've thought about it in terms of ownership. So not even necessarily whether or not I'm just going to say a collection of buildings, not a campus per se, but a collection of buildings that's owned and operated by the same owner, right? If they can take that portfolio approach, even if the buildings are scattered all about, it still allows that building owner to improve the efficiency of their portfolio in the most efficient, most effective way.
That does get more broad than if we consider not a university, but say a multifamily property developer that might have 100 different buildings. Then instead of reducing each building, they'd reduce some and leave others alone. And I think the overall result would be slightly less savings.
Nori, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I think for that multifamily component, I also like being able to take the owned and operated by a single owner approach, because sometimes you'll have 2 or 3 buildings on one, say, geothermal ground source heat pump field that's serving 3 buildings, and one building might be more efficient. It just seems from a portfolio perspective to make sense to look at them if they're owned, operated, might be 3 different utility bills, but still coming to that same owner, that's the approach that makes sense, that portfolio approach for multifamily as well.
And I can just add the Washington, I know this is the Colorado specific, but Washington, DC, I believe it is, or maybe it's one of our BPSs that exists, allows for portfolios, the portfolio approach, and the sort of alternate compliance path is such that they have to submit to the state or to the city how their portfolio will comply with the targets that their individual buildings will have, or like how they will comply as a portfolio, and then that gets approved or denied. So it's sort of, you have to submit a plan in order to verify that that's an approach you can take. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing really quick because my computer is having a spasm. There we go. Everyone's faces were shaking like this. It was a little confusing. Christine, yeah, go for it.
Can someone, maybe Crystal or Kim, kind of help me think through how this would relate to the benchmarking data you're getting in, considering that led the legalese that Crystal put into the chat? So I know that campuses were addressed in the legislation for how they benchmark, but not how they would comply with building performance standards. But does that limit how we do it here in the building performance standards part?
Yeah, I mean, it's still obviously going to be a little TBD on how buildings are going to be benchmarking. I mean, we do have the allowance for those types that she shared um, that can benchmark as a campus and submit their reports that way. So I would assume that we would almost have to have the building performance standard apply in that way to them to comply as a campus for their portfolio of buildings.
It
just
looks like
wanna-
the only ones that could comply as a campus are if they don't have sub-metering. For benchmarking.
I'd have to go back and look, sorry.
Stacy, did you have a comment?
I've been curious and I don't know if confused about this or not, but the word campus, as it's defined in Energy Star Portfolio Manager, does not mean a university campus. It means a group of buildings that share metering, right? Or, right? I mean, it's different. So the words get confusing in this way, I think, when we're talking about this, because what portfolio manager means when they say campus, and therefore maybe what our legislation means when it says campus, I don't think is the same as what we mean when we say university campus or, collection of municipal buildings campus or the state fairgrounds, or I don't even know what a hospital complex of buildings that's a hospital campus. So there's confusion, I think, in that, just the language of using these certain words.
Yeah, I was going to say, and Christine just brought this up, that I think we're going to have to dive deeper into some of these discussions, because it obviously gets more complicated once we start talking about it. So maybe we can make this one of our priorities during the optional meeting, and then come back to the group during that later April meeting and discuss more of those alternate compliance pathways.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Kim. With that, it is time for a break. So I just want to say thank you all for your focus, and we got through one of our decisions of the day. If you guys all want to make your way back here by, I believe we've got, let's see, where's my break slide? By 2:30, that would be fantastic. Well, let's say 2:25. We don't want to get you guys totally distracted. So be back in 10 minutes and we will dive into the decision-making part 2. So thanks, everybody. Talk to you soon. Okay, guys, if you can hear my voice, we'll get going in 1 minute. So make your way back to your computers. Let's turn on cameras and we'll start here in just another minute. Okay, if you can hear my voice, that means we're gonna go ahead and get started again. I hope you all had a nice break, got to stretch your legs, get a snack, use the restroom. And I hope you guys are ready for another session of awesome decision making. So we're Kirk back in. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. And we'll go ahead and dive into part 2 of today's meeting. So we have made it through the first decision. Thank you, everybody, for your deliberation, for your ideas, and for that additional consideration around campuses that we will continue to discuss offline. We are now going to move into discussing how we want to allow renewable energy to credit towards the building performance standard compliance. Before we dive into some of the proposals that the Colorado Energy Office put together per your feedback and input at the last meeting, I just wanted to remind you guys of a couple of the comments we saw on the mural board that we took into consideration. So in general, I'll let you guys read these. I'm not going to read them verbatim, but there was support to include a credit for renewable energy. But there's a caveat that we should only be counting the incremental benefit, reducing emissions beyond what the grid is already doing. And another seemingly agreed upon point was that in order to credit building owners, those building owners needed to retire the renewable energy credits associated with the renewable energy. And so we took these ideas and incorporated them into the proposal for renewable energy that we'll be asking you guys to vote on. So Kim and Will be taking us through the renewable energy proposal. So Kim, I will pass it to you to start.
Great. You can go to the next slide. Before we started, we just thought it would be helpful to go back to how EPA Energy Star Portfolio Manager defines green power. So all of those different types of renewables can be tracked in Portfolio Manager. So green power can be obtained from either on-site sources or off-site sources as long as the building owner owns the RECs for that. So energy efficiency measures can be implemented to reduce the overall energy use in a building, as we know, whereas the purchase of green power helps to reduce the environmental impacts, not the energy use associated with the generation of electricity used in a building. You can go to the next slide. And just to kind of simplify it, put a finer point on it, if the EUI is measuring the energy used in a building, renewables do not reduce that number. Renewables help reduce the grid-based energy supplied to a building, and they really, what renewables do is reduce a building's emissions. And again, in order to claim the benefits, it's critical that building owners retain the RECs. And so now you can go to the next slide. If Will is here, he can talk a little bit about how we kind of came up with this proposal. I know he had to step out to testify at some point, but so I'm not sure.
Yeah,
thanks, Kim.
Great. I don't yet have to jump out. So yeah, the proposal is that the building would receive credit based on avoided grid emissions, and that the building owners would have to retain renewable energy credits in order to get credit for those renewables. And this is really based upon the fact that ultimately the Air Quality Control Commission will be adopting these rules, and they've made it pretty clear in rules that they've adopted to date that they have a strong focus on avoiding double counting of emissions reductions. And electric utilities are already required to achieve an 80% emission reduction by 2030. 30 below 2005 levels, which they are achieving through renewables, they are required to retire the renewable energy credits in the year that they're generated in order for those renewables to count towards meeting their emissions targets. And I think it's very unlikely that the Air Commission would not apply a similar perspective to the building sector. So I think that it makes sense to credit it based upon, you know, the average grid intensity during the measurement year, or the projected average grid intensity during that measurement year, but probably would not make sense to credit it beyond that, or if the renewable energy credits weren't retained.
Yeah, and I'll just add a little bit more color to this. So again, the task force doesn't have to come up, and nor can we actually come up with what that fractional credit or percentage credit that building owners can use to get credit for those renewables. That's really going to be based on modeling and calculations on the statewide average carbon intensity of the grid. So again, we're trying to come up with some broad recommendations here that the task force can move forward with. If you agree with this, that then can be, again, modeled and calculated by the Air Division and Air Quality Control Commission. But it does ensure that there's no double counting in emissions reductions between utilities and building owners' actions. And Joel, you have a question?
Yeah, Joel.
Just a comment, really. I don't want to detract from the voting. Couple of things on the RECs. One, I think this is a great approach because it allows community solar to be an eligible reduction. In some cases, the utility will retire the REC on behalf of the consumer or the building owner. I'm not sure if that plays well with the retain language. So just wanted to clarify that sometimes retiring on behalf of the consumer should be considered. And then the other thing for on-site renewables, in cases where they are net metering and selling energy back onto the grid, those RECs do typically get included as part of that transaction, and the utility claims those RECs, just the excess beyond the usage back to the grid. So I think we want to make sure and accommodate for those. Maybe that's a special session, but wanted to point those things out.
Hey, Joel, just wanted to say on the first one, that's a great point. And certainly when we said retain the RECs, I think having the RECs retired on behalf of the customer, we should make sure that the language reflects that. That would also be considered the same as retaining the RECs.
Great, thanks, Will. And then Kirk dropped in the chat, at Fort Collins Utility, a building owner has the choice to retain the REC if they do not claim a rebate. Thanks, Kirk. Yeah, Nori.
I'm so sorry, but if I, as an affordable housing owner, sign up with Excel Solar Rewards for offsite solar, I don't know whether I'm retaining the REC or not. I don't know what that means. I don't know if I'm.
Typically, you were. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Didn't mean to interrupt.
I don't know what that means. I'm sorry.
Yeah, we actually reached out for some clarification on this, and typically the utility retains the RECs in those cases.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
And it might be different in some, power purchase agreements might have, it's really based on the contract, I think, whether or not the building owner is retaining or retiring the RECs there. It's usually specific to that contract. It's not always one way or the other.
Any other, yeah, Bill, go for it.
Yeah, I have sort of a related question. As we get higher and higher percentage renewables, Excel may have to curtail renewables. And so would there be an opportunity to use curtailed renewables as a renewable energy credit to a building? You know, California has an issue with that. They have to curtail significant renewables. So could we use the curtailed energy in a storage system, perhaps, in a building?
Yeah, potentially. That's getting into the the details that we can certainly discuss during an optional meeting. But I think that, again, the task force can make recommendations around that.
Yeah. Okay.
One clarification I can share is that in cases of curtailed renewables, it's usually a matter of nowhere to put them, grid congestion or what have you. There's no usage for them. So without storage, the grid just can't accommodate that excess energy. I think that is probably a special topic.
Right. But, you know, it represents a huge opportunity for us because if we can use those, you know, the renewable peak and the grid peak typically don't coincide. And we have this huge opportunity to use that energy to provide zero carbon something to buildings. So just a thought.
Yeah, Bill, fantastic thought. And I just wanted to add that, again, from some of the research we did, I believe it's New York City allows battery storage at the building level to be a qualified renewable resource under their sort of renewable energy crediting. So it's definitely been done, and definitely a great point to think about.
Yeah, I'm thinking thermal storage, not battery storage. So
great, thanks. Are there any other questions or reactions to the proposal that you guys are seeing on the screen? Is this sort of in line with what you were expecting? Is there anything that you're seeing that you're just not agreeable to? And I know there's things coming in the chat, so let me quickly read through a couple of these. From John, Excel Energy has a wind source program that I currently use in my building, and Excel does keep the recs. And from Kirk, additional information from our service territory: if a customer does take a rebate, they hold the recs but must retire or retain them in Fort Collins utility service territory. Oops. And then Joel, in order to use curtailed renewables, we would need to be able to store them or move them on the grid. Most curtailments occur because of an inability to do the latter. Move them on the grid. Storage should be certainly eligible, though. Thanks, Joel. Kirk, yeah.
So just a clarifying question on these proposals. So are we suggesting that the credits would contribute to the individual building owner's target? So for instance, so we just decided on site EUI, and for any on-site renewables, that would almost create some sort of an alternative pathway for that building owner to achieve compliance. Is that kind of the intent of these proposals?
Yeah, I'll jump in there, Kirk. As you know, in Denver, and I don't know if we've described that as much yet, but in Denver, how they're doing it, and also in Montgomery County, Maryland, who's also putting together their building performance standards, renewables work to kind of just lower that site EUI. That's how Denver is doing it. We're not necessarily suggesting that pathway. We think that renewables should receive some kind of credit, but we're not exactly sure if it should be lowering the site EUI, because really site EUI is all the energy you're using, including renewable energy. So that's kind of just kind of a calculation, I guess, that Denver and Montgomery County are doing in order to incentivize renewables, credit renewables. So we're not exactly sure about that right way to calculate it, but we want to ensure that renewables get some kind of fractional credit. So we'll kind of have to figure out exactly how that'll all work together. But we want to make sure that there's some kind of compliance, some kind of pathway towards compliance using renewable energy. Does that help?
Yeah, I think it helps to kind of understand how this fits in kind of the overall, so like from a building owner perspective, how they would be hitting, like how does it help them contribute, or how does it help them hit that prescribed target that we're trying to set there? Just trying to understand that. Thanks.
Right, exactly. Because really renewable energy lowers the emissions. It doesn't really lower the energy use that the building is using. So we'll have to think a little bit more about how that is calculated. And obviously we'll provide enough guidance for building owners.
I wonder if it's an and here, if it's renewables and some sort of element of electrification within the building.
Yeah, it could be.
Yeah, certainly.
Sorry, go ahead.
Just a little more context. Renewable energy credits are in units of kilowatt hours. So really what we have to determine is a 1-for-1 reduction in the numerator of the site EUI, the kilowatt hours, or is it some fraction of that? I think that's where this will lead.
Yeah, we're proposing that it's not going to be a 1-for-1 credit because the grid is getting greener. And so it would have to be some kind of fractional credit based on the average carbon intensity of the grid in order to avoid double counting.
Awesome. So are there any further questions? I think to clarify, or just to sort of round out, what we're asking you guys to vote on today is, do you or do you not agree that we should be figuring out a partial credit for building owners to allow them to use on or off-site renewable energy to help earn their site EUI compliance? What that fractional credit will be is not up to us. But we can recommend that the AQCC look into that and determine what that fractional credit would be. And then, of course, the owner must retain the RECs as well. So that's going to be the point that we'll vote on today. And then just a couple of other comments that were in the chat that I think were great. I just want to share them quickly. If you don't use the solar power as produced, you have to store it. Otherwise, it's simply a waste. Excess solar produced can also be sold back to the grid. And then at the point of being sold back to the grid, no rebates should be given. Stacy, I feel that our intent to allow renewable on-site solar was to continue to encourage buildings and owners that could put solar on site that they would, and that it would count towards the building performance standard targets as well, as defined here. Distributed solar does have some incremental value to the grid as well. Thanks, Stacy, for that. Okay, any last comments? If not, we'll move on to the vote for renewable energy.
Yeah, I was wondering if anyone else had comments around what Stacy said around whether you think we're doing enough to incentivize distributed solar, or if you have any other suggestions there.
Is the proposal broader than just renewables? Is it all DERs?
We're focusing on renewables here. I think we'll get into other DERs maybe during the optional session and at the next meeting to talk about, because I wanted to get into the topic of demand flexibility and other things here, potentially storage, but I don't think we'll have time today. So we could definitely dive into that more at the next meeting.
Yeah, a couple of hands up. Joel, why don't you start?
Sorry to bogart the time here. One thought, on-site renewables do cost more because of economies of scale. So for compliance, we can reduce the cost of compliance by enabling building owners access to large-scale renewables through RECs. So I think that does lower the cost of compliance to the building owner. And I personally am in favor of that, but I certainly understand Stacy's point about on-site generation.
Thanks, Joel. Kara?
Yeah, I just wanted to throw out, a consideration. Like how should we be considering some of these credits, including demand flexibility and electrification, in potentially like the same credit format, just for simplicity? Because I'm also like, I want to make sure that we're making this understandable and simple for kind of non-technical audiences as well. And it seems like as we're discussing renewable energy and demand flexibility and electrification, maybe they can have the same, if possible, kind of flavor of credit. So it's easy to digest.
Yeah, thanks, Kara. I think that's a great suggestion. Christine, I saw your hand was up. Did you have a comment?
Yeah, Kara said it.
Great, thanks. Okay. Well, Kim, Crystal, with that, do you think we should move on to the vote? Okay.
Yeah, I think so.
Great. So a reminder again, quickly of our process. So the question that we are, our proposal for you guys is pretty much a combination of those two bullets that were on the last slide. Does the task force want to recommend that the AQCC credit renewables based on the avoided grid emissions if the building owner retains the RECs? Quick reminder of the process. We'll have Crystal launch the poll. If we get a 50% vote or more, we will consider this proposal accepted, and then we'll go through the lobby process. So if you vote no, or if you'd like to lobby for some alteration to this, we'll call on you. You'll have 1 minute to do so. And yeah, so anyway, Crystal, if you want to launch the poll, we can go ahead and get going. Thanks.
I just wanted to point out too, do we need to change it to retain or retire the RECs, or just to Jill's point, I wasn't sure. And maybe that's something that can be lobbied, so.
Yeah, great point, Kim. I think overall, we want the RECs to be retired, whether or not it's on the building owner retires them or the utility does. I think that maybe could be lobbied, but from what I understand it, that could both of those would work. Okay.
Just a quick question from Kathy. So many people said that the provider also retains the RECs in some cases. Like the power company would retain those. So do we need to change that to say if building owners or the utility retains the RECs? I just wouldn't want a building owner to get in trouble if the other person, retains the RECs.
Actually, it wouldn't count in this case. That they would not be able to get credit if the utility owns the RECs. So if the utility owns the RECs or keeps them, then, for example, through a wind power program or often a community solar garden, the building owner could not count that then. I think that's what we're trying to say here.
So Kim, maybe I could add to this. If the building owner retains the RECs or the REC is retired on behalf of the building owner, does that seem to capture?
Yes, I think that captures it.
I'm just going to chime in with these because we're having these changes. Do we need to end the poll and restart? And I only have 11 people voting when we have 16 members on the call. So it seems like some people are not comfortable voting yet. So do we need to end this poll and reword this or restart it?
Yeah, Crystal, I think that'd be great. I'm sorry I didn't live edit that before we launched the poll. If you don't mind, I think that would be helpful so we can all have clarity as we vote on this element. Okay.
Okay, hold on. Cancel. Okay, save. Okay, I will now relaunch it.
Okay. Thank you. There we go.
And Lotus, can you just do some tracking of attendance? We're up to 15 votes right now, so this is good, but.
Yes, and I know I'm looking for Bill. Bill was popping in and out. Just make sure he's back in. Okay, great.
We have 15 votes, but I recorded 16 people. So I just want to make sure everyone's either able to vote or maybe some people have stepped away.
And just to remind folks, I'm an ex officio, so I won't be voting.
Thanks, Bill.
You covered.
And Bill, I know I saw you popping in and out of the meeting. Hopefully you're back in and you can hear us okay. The statement on the screen is we are taking a vote to does the task force want to recommend that the AQCC credit renewables based on the avoided grid emissions if the building owner retains the RECs or the REC is retired on behalf of the building owner? So, okay, great. It looks like we've got all 16 folks voted. Thanks, Crystal. All right, and it was 100% vote to accept that proposal. So you guys are making this really easy on us today. Awesome. Well, that is fantastic. Any comments or Cam or Crystal, or we feel good and we can move on to electrification?
The only comment I'll add to Kara's earlier point is that we do have proposals coming up on building electrification. We do, if we have time, we do have some information on demand flexibility that may have to be saved for an optional meeting. But to Kara's point, once we talk about these other proposals, maybe we will think about like what Kara mentioned about the credit with all of these on the same level. So we can always come back to that.
Awesome. Thank you, Crystal. Okay, great. So we are through the first two decisions of the day. You guys are making this so easy on us. So that's awesome. And this next one, we'll see. This could be a little bit more complicated. So I look forward to hearing the discussion. To bring us back to last meeting and what we heard from you guys, what we've been incorporating into our proposals for electrification. Again, these are just a couple of the comments that we received on the Miro board. But generally, we found that this task force was supportive of encouraging electrification wherever we could, especially as a means of targeting scope 1 emissions at the building level. And then another thing that was common in the comments is that we should consider partial electrification as a credit rather than full electrification because it will be easier to achieve. And there were a couple comments that noted that electrification strategy might include gas backup. And so keeping that in mind as we're encouraging electrification. So with that in mind, Kim, I'm going to pass it off to you to review our objective and proposals.
Great, thanks. And again, as Kim mentioned, we tried to take into account what we heard from task force members during the previous meeting. And we really just want to figure out how best to encourage or potentially credit beneficial electrification. Not necessarily to require it in any cases. So we recognize that building electrification can decrease site EUI while also greatly reducing scope 1 emissions. Modeling the electrification scenarios is going to be a little tricky for group 14, as Laura mentioned. They assumed, when they were doing this tool or developing this tool originally for Denver, they assumed a certain amount of voluntary electrification. And they also had some, codes and future targets that they could kind of model into that. It'd be a little bit more difficult for the statewide, since we'll just have to kind of assume a certain percentage of voluntary electrification. It's also good to note that this would require some additional reporting from the building owner and verification from the state. So that being said, we wanted to, again, come up with some kind of broad proposals that the task force can get behind. So you can go to the next slide. overall, we kind of came up with a very general recommendation at first, or proposal. So in general, the task force recommends that the AQCC encourage building owners to replace fossil fuel space and water heating equipment at end of life with efficient electric technologies. You know, we can add more qualifiers there, obviously, if it's cost effective or something like that, but we felt like this is kind of broad enough. It's not a requirement. It's really just a statement around encouraging building owners to look at this because it would greatly reduce emissions and get us closer to our goal. And then we also kind of came up with some kind of just other proposals that are similar below, that are kind of just offshoots of that more general one. So could we, or would the task force make a statement around allowing building owners to be compliant with the 2026 target if they show documentation for fully electrifying heat and hot water systems with efficient electric technologies? Or said slightly differently, would the task force say that AQCC should consider granting leniency in earning or complying with that site EUI target if a building owner has fully electrified the building and their site EUI has not increased from the 2021 baseline? So that's kind of what we wanted to throw out there, just ideas. We can modify these with other qualifiers if we want, but just wanted to put that out for consideration. And we can try to simplify it, as Kara and Christine mentioned, to be kind of a more similar to kind of the recommendation that we put forth around renewables. So we can open it up for discussion.
Thanks, Kim. And similar to what we did for the site EUI proposals, if you guys have like an option C that you would like us to consider, we can just live edit this slide. So this slide, excuse me. So yeah, would love to hear thoughts, reactions, questions, or ideas from you all. Stacey, go for it, please.
Yes, I have a question. I want to make sure that I understand how this might work, and that we're saying that if a building owner electrifies more components of their building, that we presume their site EUI is going to go up. But if the grid is getting greener, I know we're not allowed to count the grid, but if the total emissions relative to that building's total energy consumption is actually going down, then the right thing is happening. In the short term, I think we had discussed this fear that as we electrified in the short term, emissions might go up. But in the long term, emissions will go down if we electrify. So I guess I'm curious about these two, like here we're talking about site EUI, which is energy, and yet our goals are about reducing emissions. So I want to know how those two things play together over the decade coming. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah, and I can speak to that somewhat. So when you electrify with efficient technologies, we do think that there's a good chance the site EUI will go down. However, we can't model every situation. We're not sure about that. Certainly, yes, we think longer term emissions will go down, but because we're not quite sure how that will affect site EUI, we want to provide essentially a way for building owners to do the right thing, or basically be able to comply with the BPS if they electrify, because that is really supporting the long-term goal of reducing emissions. So that's kind of why we worded them this way. It's really hard to say one way or the other whether site EUI will go down or up. I mean, we think it one way, but again, models might be thrown out. So that's kind of the intent behind this. Like, hey, if a building owner shows that they did this and we can verify it, then maybe we say, great, you can comply with the 2026 target. Or maybe you have to show a little bit more. Maybe you have to show that your site EUI has not increased from the 2021 baseline or something to that effect. And I'll note, we focused on space heating and water heating because those tend to be the biggest loads. We can, include other options like cooking or something, as Paul mentioned, but that's typically the biggest load comes from space heating and water heating. And I haven't looked at the other chats yet, so.
Kara, why don't you go, and then Christine, and then we'll dive into the chats.
Great. I just wanted to kind of support having this be a full compliance pathway, and just wanted to raise that the federal building performance standard that's being developed for kind of arguably the largest portfolio in the world is based on scope 1 emissions per the executive order that was released. So it's really entirely focused on electrification. And I would say I really like these targets, because seeing that graph that group 14 showed in the beginning, it just reemphasizes how this is an area that we need to double down on. And I think doing this in a way that allows for full compliance based on electrification supports that. I think it will make our calculation math a little bit trickier, because we don't know how what the emissions will do, but I just I'm supportive, and I like the vein that both of these options are in.
Awesome. Thanks, Kara. Christine.
Same here. I agree. I like all of this. I think it should definitely be one of the alternate compliance pathways. I tend to like A a little better because it's simpler, even though B might be more accurate. I'm leaning towards simplicity at the moment, and A is just seems a little more hard hitting for saying, yeah, we need to get more systems electrified sooner, and that's a key priority. I don't know. So that's how I read it. I lean slightly towards A. There's some comments in the chat about cooking. I agree with all that, especially for the indoor air quality benefits. But if our focus here is on greenhouse gas emissions, I had heard from Denver that the heating and water heating were 99% and the cooking was 1%. So it just was minuscule. And I think the benefits would be large in multifamily buildings for cooking. So I could go either way on that. I think it could be a hardship on buildings that have restaurants. We do know that restaurants can do all electric heating, but there would be a lot of resistance there. And if that is part of if you need to do that for this compliance path, then buildings with restaurants just might not do it at all. So there was a lot there. I think simplest would be to exclude cooking, but I could go either way for if it's included in multifamily.
Thank you, Christine. Any responses to Christine? I know you guys have touched on a couple of things in the chat. Joel, go for it.
Yeah, sorry. Number B2 concerns me a little bit. I do agree with Kara and Christine on A, and B1 certainly, but B2, I suppose it is possible that someone could electrify. Their site EUI goes up, and yet their emissions are going down. So I think we should consider that possibility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Joel. Okay, well, I'm going to go through and just share a couple of the thoughts from the chat. A couple of comments around cooking that Christine and Kara brought up, why we should include that. Joel dropped a comment in the chat about electrifying on-site motors that otherwise would be fossil fueled as a way of thinking about which systems to electrify in the building. Another comment about including cooking, especially for indoor air quality for low-income housing. And then Jenny asked a good question: how is this inclusive of buildings that can afford to electrify? Chances of a larger services coming into play with electrifying buildings, and that generally some buildings might not be able to afford to electrify. So definitely something to be considering. And Crystal's response that this electrification proposal, this as a compliance path would not be required. It would simply be an option for buildings if they wanted to use that as their method of complying with the BPS. Stacy, in both A and B, my hesitation is with the word fully electrifying those systems. And then thanks, Kathy. I would agree if we are trying for eager compliance, we should exclude cooking. I don't think we want the ire of the restaurant industry, especially in light of the challenges they've had in the last couple of years. So really great comments and thoughts. Thanks, everybody. So it sounds like—
I wanted to make, I'm sorry, Jenny Gonzalez, IBEW. I needed to clarify my point. It's for those buildings who cannot afford to fully electrify, the addition of a larger service or a service change out will make a big play in the price of all this too. So electrifying comes with big choices.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Jenny.
So is there, as going back to the renewable energy discussion, does the group want to provide any kind of partial credit, I guess, or fractional credit towards partially electrifying systems? For example, yeah, if they just did all the space heating, but not the hot water systems, or they did space heating and cooking or something like that, some kind of a menu of options, and they, at least do a few of them or something.
Christine?
I'd be interested in exploring that idea for partial if they are just using existing gas systems for supplementary heat on extra cold days, which we've heard is important for existing buildings, maybe not necessary for new buildings. I like fully better, but maybe that's a reality. So rather than defining partial as either space heating or water heating, maybe it's just whether you allow supplementary gas backup. And I could go either way on that, but I think it would have to have some limits, such a percentage of the load that's covered, or that the supplementary wouldn't kick on if it's above 20 degrees or something like that. And I also don't know how that would be made simple, because fully is obviously best.
Thanks, Christine. Kirk?
Christine kind of reiterated my thought there, just there at the end, is trying to make that as simple as possible. And if, partial credit may be really difficult to interpret, and then also implementing that on the state side could be equally as challenging to kind of police that. It could be as easily as addressing that fully electrifying kind of statement there and looking at a percentage based on load or square footage or something to that effect. I would support that as a third option.
Thanks, Kirk. Stacy?
Yeah, I think my comment about fully is about, I might not be able to do it all today. I do want to encourage people to start leaning into it. And so maybe I can do this system today. Maybe I do this next system a year from now or 2 years from now. I might not be able to do everything. So this idea of saying we're going to allow it only if you fully do it, that gives me a reason to say I can't do it then, or I'm not going to do it. And I want to encourage people. How do we encourage them to get on the path? Electrification is the direction we need to go. But if we say all or nothing right out of the gate, it gives a lot of people a reason to say I can't do it or won't do it.
Thanks, Stacey. That was a helpful clarification. Kara?
I just wanted to add to Stacey's comment too, like for buildings that are already efficient but not all electric, could we somehow encourage them to look into electrifying? Maybe it's using similar language, which I think mirrors what Denver's doing right at the end of life, but somehow not let efficient buildings entirely off the hook, but encourage them to go down this path.
And just to throw an idea out there too, not that we don't have enough, but kind of going back to what Kara and Stacy was saying, with the A option, we put compliant with 2026 targets. Is there another third option for providing some type of credit for partial electrification by 2026 and then full electrification by 2030? Does that, there could be something around that as well?
Well, you guys ponder that. I'm going to read a couple of the thoughts in the chat. So from Kathy, I think the more compliance paths and or options we provide building owners, especially existing buildings, will give us a chance to get to our goals. In Denver, I know we have allowed for supplementary use of existing systems in order to meet the needs in very cold and very hot weather loads. And then Bill, I agree with an alternate compliance path, but I think we need to be careful. Electrification can be hard and really expensive in some buildings. We also need to allow for future changes like renewable natural gas and hydrogen, which may make electrification less desirable. Okay, so generally,
can I add a thought on that?
Of course.
It might be really hard and really expensive for some buildings, but not for others. And that's why it's an alternative compliance path, because we would let buildings choose which path they like best. So if they are one of the buildings where it can be really hard and expensive, then they wouldn't go down it. And I think we could allow for changes such as renewable natural gas and hydrogen in the future, but we know that this is one technology that's available now. So I would say that we definitely encourage this now.
Thanks, Christine. A couple thoughts from Paul. Many of our clients will want to retain some gas heating for cold temps. I'd like to offer a compliance path for those folks. Jenny, still very concerned about the end cost and that being trickled down to the occupant renting the space, especially in multifamily dwelling in affordable housing. Thanks, Jenny. And then Kirk proposing a third option, show documentation that 50% of the building's energy load is supported by efficient electric technology. Maybe I'll pause there and see any responses to Jenny or Paul, and then any thoughts on Kirk's third proposal. And I can start live editing this slide while you guys chat.
How did we manage to just allow for some amount of on-site renewable electricity without defining how much? And that seemed really easy. And now when we say beneficial electrification, we're worried about how much, how little, or how much. Isn't some better than none? Or, I mean, do we need to define a percent, or maybe I'm missing the mark here?
Yeah, I don't think we need to get too into the weeds and say 50% or more necessarily. I think it can be that the recommendation is something along the lines of the task force recommends that building owners receive some partial credit towards compliance or something like that, depending on the percentage of building energy load that is supported by efficient electric technology. For example, something like that. Again, and this is, we're trying to make a pathway easy for electrification. We're not requiring it, just to clarify that. Building owners are not going to be required to electrify. This is a pathway they can use if it makes sense for them, if it's cost effective, if they want to do this. And it's just saying that, yes, if they do this fully, that they can be in compliance with that 2026 target. We can certainly provide other pathways for, partially electrifying and provide credits based on that. That's why we were coming up with this. I mean, essentially, we just want to come to an agreement, to a consensus on some of these just overall recommendations that the AQCC should look at.
I'll also chime in here since we have about 15 minutes left of our meeting. And Kimberly, maybe if we actually switch to slide 39, or we could also stay on the slide as well, but I'm thinking about wordsmithing and maybe some of these details we talk about in the optional meeting that is coming up in April. But maybe we can actually just get a general vote, like Kim was saying, about just recommending that, you know, this is optional, it's not required, that the AQCC provides some credit to people who either partially or fully electrify. And so maybe we can get some wordsmithing down for a general statement and a vote around that.
Yeah, Crystal, that sounds great. And before we do that, let's get John and Christine's comments, and then yeah, we can move on to the vote. Thanks.
Yeah, real quick. I just wanted to make sure I read that and what Kim had said, that we definitely want to allow, thank you. We want the AQCC to encourage electrification, but like A, to me, how I'm reading A is that if you fully electrify and everything goes to crap and you save no greenhouse gas emissions, you're still in compliance. Is that how I'm reading A? Because they fully electrified?
It would essentially, you know, more or less be saying, if you electrify your heat and hot water systems, then you could be compliant with the target regardless of site EUI.
Okay, I just wanted to verify that. Thank you.
Yep, you got it, John. Christine?
Then a topic for the optional meeting, I would make sure that there's guardrails if we do allow partial. For instance, 80% of the heating load is met through the heat pump, or that the supplementary heat doesn't kick on above 20 degrees, something like that. That's what's considered in state legislation and Denver code proposals respectively, because I don't want a brand new gas furnace and a really teeny tiny heat pump to count.
Great, yeah, thank you, Christine. Okay, so why don't we move on to slide 39, and thanks, Crystal, for making those updates to our vote. And I guess, Kim and Crystal, what do you guys think about offering up a chance to lobby here, where if there are specifics that folks want to lobby for, we encourage that they vote no, so that they can have that minute of lobbying. We can track all of those like nuanced comments that we've been hearing from you guys. I mean, we're all capturing all of this in the notes, but that way it might lend ourselves to really trying to nail down the detail. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I think we can lobby and vote. I was just gonna, I don't think in this more general recommendation that we need to focus on partially or fully here, because we're just saying that, yeah, basically the task force recommends that the AQCC encourage building owners to replace equipment at end of life with efficient. I mean, we don't have to necessarily specify, I don't think, partially or fully here, because we're not focused on that. It's really just around replacing it. And I'm fine with doing kind of a lobby and vote exercise.
And Kim, in that vein, do you think we should take out space and water heating, or do we want to keep that layer in?
Oh, this, let's take, I think it was just, let's just take out fossil fuel. Yeah. Thank you.
Awesome.
Yep.
Okay. Great. Well, then in that case, let us lobby and vote. So we will launch a poll to vote on this. And what I would like you guys to think about is, if there's a qualifying notion that you would like to make sure we're including in this overall proposal, I think what we'll do is not vote on those sub proposals. We took your notes, we sort of made edits, we added some proposals so we won't move on to a vote for those options A, B, or C. But if you have an idea of something you really want to make sure gets included in this, maybe we take an initial vote, and I'm sorry, I'm just sort of thinking through this on the fly because I want to make sure I'm capturing all of this really great information. So maybe we take an initial vote, yes or no, to this statement. And then we'll allow folks, if they want to raise their hand and lobby for those specific elements, we can have you guys do that and it won't impact this statement in this direct vote. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and then this statement that we're voting on now is really just language around a recommendation to the AQCC. We're not saying it's necessarily a compliance pathway. I think that's what those other clarifying proposals are. So it's really just, we want to recommend that the AQCC look at this, and then we can get into more specifics around how building owners would comply. So that's what I was thinking around Kirk's question.
Okay, great. So
I think those more specific recommendations are more around how building owners would comply, but this is a general statement.
Okay, great. So then in that case, let us host a vote for the statement that you guys see on your screen. So the task force recommends that the AQCC encourage building owners to replace fossil fuel equipment at the end of life with efficient electric technologies. And we will still lobby and vote. So if there's something about this generalized high-level statement that you would like to change or alter, feel free to vote no, and we can have that lobby. Otherwise, as the time allows for the last couple minutes of our meeting, we'll try and capture all of those little specific nuances of how this might work. So thanks, Crystal, for launching it, and let you guys take a moment to vote.
And
thanks,
Lotus,
sorry.
Go on.
I was just going to say, thanks, Stacy, for your comment about getting the details right. I know we want to encourage beneficial electrification and support building owners that could begin to take those steps as soon as possible and to the degree possible. So that's why we kind of wanted to start with a broad general statement around, getting consensus on that, and then maybe start, figuring out some of those details after. Go ahead.
Also,
Crystal.
Lotus, I have 14 people voting. Are we waiting on a 15th member? I know some people are leaving the meeting.
Yeah, I think some one or two people might have left.
So okay, I will end the poll at 14.
Yep, that's good.
Thanks. Okay. Awesome. So it seems as though the majority, definitely we have a 2/3 consensus that we will recommend to the AQCC that they encourage building owners to replace fossil fuel equipment at the end of life with electric technologies. So we only have a few minutes left. Kim, maybe we just wrap up and we'll dive into more of the detail around the electrification specifics at a future work session.
Yeah, let's do that. We can definitely dive in more at the optional meeting if you can attend. Jenny, you can feel free to chat your vote to us if you want then, and we can get you included if you missed a vote. And then Kara, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, I just had a process question. Thanks. I'm wondering what happens when is this all the churning that we as a task force will get to do before we send the recommendations to the AQCC, or is it something where we'll add meat to the bones of this high level structure and then send it to them?
Yeah, it's definitely an iterative process. And of course, as you know, we have to also vet this with all of the stakeholders through public engagement process as well. So there'll be opportunities to, modify these recommendations, but we are just trying to get some consensus on the general direction we're moving in, if that's helpful.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, Kara, the meat, we can add as much meat as the task force wants on the bones, and any meat that's not added, the AQCC can kind of take these larger high level recommendations and add the meat themselves, I guess. Okay, great. Well, let's then go ahead and wrap up. So we'll move quickly through some of those things we were going to vote on. All right, so next steps. We have our next optional meeting is coming up on April 13th from 1 to 2 p.m. And I have the topic written here as grid demand response. That was a topic we wanted to cover today. We knew we would run out of time. So that will be, I think, addressed in that meeting. And but it sounds like from today's meeting, there might be a couple of different topics that we want to dive into, making sure that we have enough time to cover them adequately. So all to say, we will follow up with you all. We'll chat internally. We'll follow up with you guys on sort of the topic of the next optional meeting so that you know what to expect if you're able to show up. Kim, anything else you want to add there?
No, I don't think so. We'll just, Crystal and I will get together and figure that out. Definitely we'll touch on the topics that needed more diving into here, including some of these proposals, the BE proposals, demand flexibility, and maybe even touch on EVs during that one as well. Great,
thanks, Kim. And for those who won't be able to make the optional meetings, we want to make it clear that the meeting notes, that all of that information will be available to all of the task force members. So if you miss it, you'll be able to catch up. And if there are any things that come out of those optional meetings, such as like a proposal for grid demand response, those things we will bring back to the task force, and know that no voting will happen in those optional meetings. They'll really be discussion based. The next task force meeting is April 27th, same time. So we look forward to chatting with you guys then. And the topics we still have to cover as a task force include our alternative compliance pathways. So that includes, you know, the conversations around hardship and buildings that might have difficulty in complying with our core building performance standards. So how do we want to treat some of those, or do we have an idea of how we want to recommend treating those? Planning for our public engagement, workforce and equity considerations, and then programs to support compliance. So we're running up just a few meetings left and a lot to still cover. So I just really want to say thank you and appreciate you guys for staying on track today, for having such great engagement and thoughtfulness around this topic. And although we didn't dive into too many specifics, I feel really great that we got a solid vote on all of the topics that we really wanted to make sure we hammered out today. So I just want to say thank you. And I appreciate your guys' engagement today. So with that, if you guys have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to the CDO team or myself or Hillary. We're here to answer those questions. Feel free to post those on monday.com or shoot us an email, and we'll follow up with all of our meeting materials in a couple of days. So any closing words from you, Kim?
Oh, I just want to say thank you so much. Thanks, Christine. I'm still ready. There's some more chats going on, which is awesome. Appreciate people putting some more proposals into the chat so that we can capture those and talk a little bit more about those during the optional meeting, and then really do a vote on those during the next full meeting. But again, appreciate everyone's attention and engagement today. And please reach out to us if you have any, again, questions or comments in the interim.
Okay. Happy Wednesday, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your days. Take care. Thanks for being here. All right. All right. Oh, there's a funny live stream background noise going on.